We have 5 people here at the moment. We had a bunch more signed up. I haven't gotten any emails from people saying that they weren't here, so maybe it's a bit delayed. We're going to start off the webinar. This is the webinar on HB315, hydro and solar. We're organizing this webinar because we've had a lot of questions about how HB315 is affecting our communities, and a lot of people that are interested in how they can use this bill for their local communities, for themselves, and just to learn more about it. I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director, Sam Evans-Brown, to talk about it a little bit more.
Hi, folks. Thank you for making the time to be here. So for those who don't know, Clean Energy New Hampshire for years has been an advocate for increasing our net metering caps. And the reason for that really is that solar benefits enormously from economies of scale, and those economies of scale really do start to ramp up once you get past the 1 megawatt project size. And so if solar energy is going to be an affordable option for everybody who wants to take advantage of it, be it someone who just doesn't have a great site at their own personal home, or folks who are bigger customers, a 1 megawatt cap really doesn't make a lot of sense in a lot of ways. And that was a fight that went for years and years. Those who've been paying attention for a while may remember the override the veto effort that took place in 2018. Am I getting that right, esteemed panelists? Indeed. So 2018, there was a bill that was passed. The governor vetoed it, and there was a huge effort mounted to try to override those vetoes. They were not successful, but 315 was the first progress that was made on the effort to get past this arbitrary cap of 1 megawatt on net metered projects up to a size that really is more reflective of something that would make sense for community scale solar. We are very excited about 315, and I think that the numbers are sort of they're starting to materialize to bear out exactly how exciting that is. So I reached out briefly to Eversource just to hear, you know, sort of what the scuttlebutt is. And what they have said is that since May of 2021, they've already had 25 applications for new projects in the 1 to 5 megawatt range, which if all of them were to be completed, which is not necessarily the case, obviously, when you have these preliminary applications, it's a project that's in very early stages, and many of those might not materialize. But if they were all to be completed, it would be 105 new megawatts of solar capacity. But of course, it's not just about solar. This is about supporting existing hydro projects as well. And then there's another 30 or 40 megawatts or so, and I think Madeleine can give you better numbers on that, of existing hydro units in New Hampshire that are in that 1 to 5 megawatt range that now can get support from their local municipalities and ensure that they will remain viable financially for the long term and won't drop off the grid as so many small hydro projects have done. So for those of you who are on this webinar who are representing municipalities, welcome. What we hope is that we have a panel here that can really answer a lot of the nuts and bolts questions that you might have about how to take advantage of 315, what your community will need to do, what are the sort of best practices when it comes to trying to interact with these projects. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to the panelists, and I'm very excited. I'll let each of you introduce yourselves. It is my preference that folks do their own introductions versus me doing sort of ham-handed readings of your bios. But I will introduce Madeleine Mineau, who's with Essex Hydro, and who was the previous executive director of Clean Energy New Hampshire, and really led a lot of the fight to expand net metering. And so I think is a really worthy person to lead us off here.
Thanks, Sam. As he mentioned, my current role is Chief Operating Officer at Essex Hydro. And so we own and operate 14 small hydropower projects in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what the net metering part of House Bill 315 did. So we're talking about the bill as if there was a lot of other things in there. It actually started out as a community power bill, and then the net metering language got added on at the end. And so, not to cause confusion, other folks may talk about things that HB 315 did that are more focused on community power and not related to net metering. That also was done in this bill that became law. So we're going to focus on the net metering part of HB 315. And what it allows is for renewable generators up to 5 megawatts, so just under 5 megawatts, to act as group hosts if, and only if, all of their members are political subdivisions. So primarily that means municipality, school, and county accounts. So other than that, you mostly would have to abide by all of the rules and be eligible for the tariffs of current group net metering for what are called large customer generators. So previous to this law, group net metering and net metering only was for generators that either fell into the small customer generator category, which was up to 100 kilowatts in capacity, or large, which was over 100 up to 1 megawatt. So effectively, there was a companion bill passed that made it clear that new generators or generators between 1 and 5 megawatts that are going to use this municipal host provision will be treated like the large customer generators under the existing law and rules until or unless specific tariffs and rules are developed for these new municipal hosts. So that's helpful. That created some clarity so that things could get started faster. We don't have to go through an involved rulemaking at the PUC to figure out how much should these projects be compensated. So to be clear, that the net metering credit for those projects will be the default energy service rate of the utility that's in effect at the moment. So that's the credit, just like those other net metering projects that fall into the large category. They're not credited distribution or transmission or any of the other charges on the bill. Additionally, just like current group hosts, in order to register, you have to have members whose total load is at least equal to or greater than your historical generation if you're an existing generator, or your projected generation if you are going to be a new project. So what that means is that on an annual basis, all of the members, if you add up all of their electric bills, they have to consume at least as much electricity as the host or generator is going to consume. You can't file an application with, now it's going to be the Department of Energy, used to be the PUC, to register as a group host unless you have those members. You have to have agreements or contracts signed with those members, and you have to certify that. Just like another existing hosts, you're going to have to do an annual true up. So that is going to be verified on an annual basis, actual electricity used by the members and actual electricity generated by the host. If the members didn't use at least as much electricity as the host generated, there is a true up calculation, and so you're going to have to pay back some of the revenue that you received as a host. And some of the other limitations are that the host and all the members have to be in the same utility service territory. So if the host is in Eversource territory, all the members have to be in Eversource territory. Additionally, there is one new requirement only for these municipal host projects over a megawatt up to 5. If they are a new facility, so not already in service when the law passed, they also have to have the host and all the members located within the same municipality. So that is an additional pretty strict requirement. So if you are building a new project in one town, all your members have to be in that town. That doesn't apply to existing facilities. So that's where we as small hydro generators have existing facilities that are over a megawatt, under 5 megawatts, that now are eligible to be group hosts. And because those are existing facilities, the requirement is that the customers have to be within the same utility service territory and be those subdivisions of the government. There has been some questions already, I think, that have gone to the PUC and the Department of Energy about what falls under those subdivisions of the government. The example given in the law is public schools, municipalities, and counties. There have been some questions about would community colleges fit, or public universities like the University of New Hampshire. Both of those, we've been told no, those are not eligible members under this law. There may be some efforts to try and change that legislatively, but currently no. Similarly, private schools are not eligible. So it is really narrowly defined for those municipalities and other things that are associated with municipal governments. I think you may be able to get to, if there's a municipal utility, for example, like the water district or something like that, but it really has to be one of those public entities. The state of New Hampshire itself also is not eligible, from what I have been told, because they are not a subdivision of the state government, they are the state government. So that may be something else also where there may be some effort legislatively to include that. So that's the overview of what the law allows for generators and members. So if you are a municipality, for example, or a county or a public school, an SAU, you have a couple of options. You could become a member, group net metering member of any existing eligible renewable facility in your utility service territory, or you could work to develop a new renewable energy resource, but then it would have to be located in the same municipality as you are. So we, as small hydro generators, have a couple of our hydropower facilities that have become eligible to become municipal group hosts. I've been recruiting members. Our two facilities that we're recruiting members for are in Unitil service territory. So that's not a huge area. So our potential pool of members is somewhat restricted. We're hoping to put together our first group by the end of the year. We have, I think, most of our members lined up for that. And then we're recruiting a second group that would launch in the spring. So if there are any folks in Unitil territory who are interested, you're certainly welcome to reach out to me. There are other small hydro facilities that are not owned or operated by us in Eversource territory that I know are also putting together and recruiting group members. So certainly I could help put folks in touch with those. I'm not aware of anyone in Liberty territory that is currently existing hydro that would be eligible under this law. So that's, I think, what I'll stop with, and I'm trying to remember who I'm handing it off to. Joe or Dan? Dan.
Thank you, Madeleine. I think I'm up next. Great to follow after you, and thank you so much for your leadership as former executive director of Clean Energy New Hampshire in getting this and other key policy changes through. And of course, thanks to Sam and the team for keeping it going. Revision Energy, which I'm honored to represent here, is a longtime member of Clean Energy New Hampshire, active across the residential and commercial markets for solar PV, as well as in complementary technologies like battery systems and electric vehicle charging and thermal systems on the thermal side to try and help families, but also organizations and communities comprehensively move off of fossil fuels. And I'm proud to represent our 300 co-owners. We're an employee-owned company and certified B Corp working across New Hampshire as well as Maine and Massachusetts. Just to briefly frame my comments, folks are all aware that the COP26 climate conference just wrapped up this weekend over in Scotland. We're also coming into winter here, of course. As I've been reminded these mornings, was actually out in the backyard with the kids raking the leaves over the weekend. And I gotta say, kind of confounded by the fact that here in mid-November, my grass is all still green. Even though we've had tiny bit of frost a couple mornings so far, it's been in the 60s. It'll be back up there, I think, this Thursday in southern New Hampshire. And of course, we know that's just one small symptom of the fact that real climate damage is occurring, not just in some theoretical future, but today from our fossil fuel emissions locally and of course globally. We know that just in my lifetime, as NHPR has reported, winter temps are up 5.8 degrees on average just in the last not even 40 years. And what that's doing to our wildlife, to our maples, tick populations. I picked up at least 3 ticks, hopefully not more than that, last week when I was out on a site visit, again, mid-November, is just very concerning. So I any chance I get, want to remind us what I think everybody on this call knows, that the climate crisis is urgent and is upon us, and the work that we're doing and that I know many folks representing New Hampshire towns and cities are doing is imperative, particularly because, sad to say, New Hampshire is far behind the curve. When we speak of solar, less than 1% of our electricity in this state, still less than 1%, comes from the sun. Just down in Massachusetts, they're pushing 20%, I think 18.5 by latest count. Over in Vermont, 15+%, and Maine, because of some significant policy changes 2 years ago, is rapidly on track to hit those benchmarks and even go beyond. So a lot of work to do. Arguably the biggest limiting factor in the state has been that 1 megawatt arbitrary net metering cap, which was lifted, but unfortunately in a very incremental way through the passage of HB 315. So I thought I would just underscore a couple of the key points that Madeleine made, try to speak a little more specifically to those towns and counties perhaps that may be on today, in terms of what specifically, how you can take advantage, and those unfortunately who can't under the current regulations. And then I did want to mention some proposed incremental changes to open it up, not nearly as widely as has been proposed and in fact passed with bipartisan majorities in the past, but a modest incremental step that we think could garner enough bipartisan support to take this a little bit further in the coming 2022 legislative session. So first off, 2 key points to underscore. Unlike previous bills that were passed and nearly, in fact, overrode governor vetoes, this bill to raise the net metering cap from 1 megawatt to 5 has 2 key limiting factors. Number 1, projects need to be sited within the same jurisdiction as the entities that are using that power, the energy off-takers, as we say, not just in the same utility territory, which covers dozens of towns, whichever utility you're in, but in the same municipal bounds. So if you're offsetting city load or town load, the project needs to be sited within that same town or city. Can be a little bit more flexible if you're talking about a regional school district. There's a handful of those that cover multiple towns. I went to Conval, which covers 9 small towns in the Monadnock area. In that case, our understanding is a project can be sited within any of those towns, offsetting load for that political subdivision, that school district, even if the load is in another town, but is part of the same regional school district. Or most flexibly would be the case of our counties, our 10 counties, which of course include dozens of towns. So number 1, the geographical requirement, projects have to be sited in the same jurisdiction. Number 2, even more limiting, unfortunately, is that only those entities whose public sector load exceeds that 1 megawatt output can go beyond it. As Madeleine said, the political subdivision, the municipality in most cases, have to use 100% of the generation based on historic consumption levels, kilowatt hours per year, or a reasonable projection of future consumption. And that is modeled against the, using industry standard tools, the projected output of the new clean energy generator. When we're talking solar, a 1 megawatt solar farm on the AC inverter side can put out about 1.8 million kilowatt hours per year. That means that any jurisdiction, any municipality, county, school district that uses more than 1.8 million kilowatt hours may be a candidate to take advantage of HB 315 as it pertains to the net metering cap, but only as far above 1 megawatt as their load will allow. We don't have load data for all 230 plus New Hampshire towns and cities, or 10 counties, or a couple dozen regional school districts, but we've analyzed loads for a bunch and have been privileged over the years to work with a couple dozen New Hampshire towns and cities and schools. And by our estimates, only a few dozen New Hampshire communities can actually access this law. A typical New Hampshire town, particularly if there's no centralized public water or sewer services, You're just talking the town hall, the public works department, perhaps highway garage, what have you. Typical New Hampshire town is just a few hundred thousand kilowatt hours, if that. A smaller town may not even break 100,000. It's really only our 13 cities that are typically over 1 million kilowatt hours. But again, you need to be over 1.8 million kilowatt hours in order to exceed the current 1 megawatt cap. So by our estimates, again, it's a very small number. Not even all of our 13 municipalities are likely to exceed that, and very few of them to go up to the 7 to 8 million kilowatt hours, or even a little higher, that a max size 5 megawatt solar array would put out each year. And in those cases, of course, when we're talking about our largest cities, I'm here in Nashville, which has plenty of load, but because once again, the project needs to be sited within the same geography, the same city bounds, unfortunately, the population centers that have the load are by definition the most dense communities, which are least likely to have the land that can take advantage of the load to meet the geographic requirements. So as a consequence, that means HB315 is great for a handful of our cities with large loads and large populations, if they can site it, and is a good opportunity for many of our counties. We know not all 10 counties have enough load, but many of them, when you consider the nursing home and perhaps some wastewater treatment around that, courthouse, some other facilities, many of them are likely to get at least a little bit over the current 1 megawatt cap. So can be candidates to take advantage. That's a bit of the gloomy news, to be honest. On the plus side, we do think that this can form the basis for further legislative progress that can attract broad bipartisan support. And specifically, I just want to briefly mention some proposed legislation that we're very pleased Senator Avard has introduced. The exact language is still being refined. That's the Republican chair of the Senate Energy Committee. And what this would do, a couple of things very briefly, is one, expand the pool of communities, or in this case, actually mostly private sector entities that can take advantage of a larger than 1 megawatt net metering cap by allowing those who have the load, not just municipalities, but also businesses, to build above 1 megawatt and up to 5, provided that they use a large share of that generated output themselves within an annual cycle. Still working on the finer print in terms of whether this is based on their peak demand or their annual consumption. Historic bills, which the governor actually did support 2 years ago, introduced by Representative Lang, would have addressed the former, where a very large energy user, an industrial manufacturing business in New Hampshire with over 1,000 kilowatts or 1 megawatt in real-time load could exceed the 1 megawatt cap. We are arguing that maybe a slight expansion beyond that to include more businesses that are paying and will shortly be paying even higher electricity rates, as those are expected to go up, that would be appropriate by basing that on the annual consumption, provided that, again, they are using that power themselves. So that would be one innovation in the new legislation that Senator Avard has gotten behind and has introduced. A second piece of this is a companion to those small businesses, nonprofits, but also municipalities. Anybody that doesn't have the load for multiple million kilowatt hours per year, a multi-megawatt project, but does have the ability to, the roof space, the ground space, to install a mid-sized solar array. For instance, if it's a local elementary school, enough roof space to install, say, 200 kilowatts, that would be something on the order of 20,000 square feet, pretty typical for an elementary school. Certainly a middle school could typically go beyond that. Instead of being stuck in what amounts to a sort of donut hole, where because of our small and large customer generator definitions in the PUC 900 rules, it generally doesn't make any sense for an entity to go above 100 kilowatts unless they can go way above it and realize some economies of scale. Because once you cross that 100 kilowatt threshold, your energy value drops significantly. Under net metering, it goes from the formula worked out in 2017 and the net metering settlement, which is supply plus transmission and a quarter of distribution, down to supply only. And that is very challenging in terms of making the economics work, particularly, again, because we are proposing that this 100 kilowatt threshold would be raised to 500 for those entities that use that power themselves in the course of an annual cycle. And the rationale here briefly is that we want to intelligently site renewable generators close to and even behind existing load. Those are the cases which we know provide clear benefits to the grid by reducing peak demand, something we've discussed at some length with the different utilities who have conveyed a similar interest in seeing generators sited intelligently to reduce system peak, which will benefit all ratepayers, rather than what can sometimes be a challenge at installing large remote solar farms at the end of a circuit, which are sending that power back to the grid 100%. So those are a couple of the changes. 1 megawatt to 5 for large energy users, 100 kilowatts to 500 kilowatts on the small customer generator definition for those smaller users to get a little bit more value, provided in both cases they're using that power themselves and reducing system peak to benefit all ratepayers. A couple other pieces of the bill that I don't need to go into in detail, but increasingly we're finding in the industry that interconnection costs are very challenging. The standards are hard to predict, quite variable, very transparent. And so the legislation would also try to apply some best practices that have been learned in other states to make that process a bit more transparent and predictable, and also ensure that any developer, but also hosts looking to install projects can have better visibility into the current capacity of the grid through accessing hosting maps that are available in other states to, again, intelligently site projects that will deliver maximum benefit, not just to the host in reducing their own electricity costs, but also to the community as a whole in reducing peak demand. And with that, I think I will hand it over to Joe.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, Joe Harrison, Vice President of Project Development for ReWild Renewables. And just want to thank Dan and Revision for all the work they do on state policy. They're a leader in that space, and we certainly appreciate it and look to support them in their efforts of progressing community solar in New Hampshire. And so I don't want to restate all of the great things Dan said, but I'll just reiterate that we fully support an increase to this 1 megawatt cap, and HB315 will allow some projects to move forward, and that's great. To give the developer solar company perspective, it doesn't create a new market for us where we can deploy resources and go in to New Hampshire and develop new projects from scratch. I think the types of projects that will be able to move forward under this, some of them have been in the works. Towns like, or cities like Manchester and Concord, I think have gone out to bid in the past in hopes that this legislation would pass, and then those projects stalled out. But so some of the projects are known and will involve RFPs or already have, but just based on there only being so many entities with over a megawatt of load, a lot of the great sites that are out there are not eligible for this program because they're sited in communities that don't have enough load to participate. But having said that, we appreciate that this is a step in the right direction for New Hampshire, and it'll be great to see some capped landfill projects move forward. And I've been developing solar for 14 years and I enjoy the brownfield landfill side of things, and have been lucky enough to develop a lot of those projects in other New England states. And I think that everyone seems to agree that brownfields and landfills are a great use of space from a land use perspective. There's not many competing interests for capped landfills, maybe a soccer field here and there in a really developed area, but solar is just a great use because it's temporary. You're putting a ballasted system over a capped landfill, so you're not penetrating the cap of the landfill. There's cement ballast blocks that are used to keep the racks in place, and it generates energy savings for the community, sometimes a land lease, and property tax revenue potentially. So there's at least 3 different potential revenue streams for towns. And I was one example of a project that I worked with the town of Peterborough, and they did just under 1 megawatt in a former sludge lagoon next to their wastewater treatment plant. And it's an example of a project that would have been a little larger if not for the artificial 1 megawatt cap that was in place at the time. So that's an example of a project like that wouldn't be restricted in that way if it moved forward today, and it could simply take up as much space as was available instead of having to stay under that megawatt. Another project next to a landfill is in the town of Warner, and I worked with them as a consultant, and they're obviously a small town, but if additional legislation opens this program up, that's an example of a town that probably could host a larger system. They just don't have any more load, so only did a couple hundred kilowatts. But in the future, under an expanded version of this, you know, you might be able to site a large project in a town like Warner and sell the electricity to, say, Nashua or someone within the same utility zone. In terms of towns who might be on the webinar that do have landfills, it's around 3 to 4 acres for 1 megawatt of solar. So we're talking about projects in the 5 to 20 acre range. And generally speaking, you can install solar on a landfill up to around 20 degrees of slope. So you're kind of, if you picture a landfill with steep side slopes, you're generally avoiding those and focusing on the acreage on the crown that's relatively flat. And so as municipal employees, you know, now would be a great time to figure out, you know, how much land you might have available, and potentially, you know, if you use more than 1 megawatt, be going out for RFP. And I think there's several people on this call, and that could help a town steer them in the right direction to go through that process. So thanks. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. And so kicking it back to Sam, maybe?
I'll take you. I'll follow up with you on that, Joe.
Yeah, thanks.
So thanks, Joe. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Madeleine. This is Andrew Keller from New Hampshire Solar Garden. We've been working, you know, within the state for many years. I'm not quite as mature and old as Joe, even though the amount of hair I have in my head may not show it. As far as how long I've been in the business, we've been about 10 years or so in the business. And Joe and I have had the luxury of kind of, I think, competing as we're, you know, friends and professional peers, and we've had a chance to follow each other. You know, watching his work in Peterborough was an exciting kind of first big project in New Hampshire that we all saw. And, you know, for us, it was really an inspiration to see the innovation that Peterborough put in place to utilize that parcel the way they did. You know, we were fortunate enough to be able to kind of follow Joe's lead and move down the path of using some of the landfill sites in a couple different communities in New Hampshire, with some similar success that Joe had back in his prior role. And we focused our attention early on the Milton, town of Milton's landfill site. And it was an exciting project. It was a project that took time. And I just want to share some of those details with the audience, just so people can get a flavor for some of the work that Joe and I have been working on in New Hampshire. to support some of his thoughts on the value of that land and the usage of that land, but also want to set some expectations for if there's any folks from towns that are on the webinar today, just to help people understand what it takes from this point to actually seeing panels on the landfill and cutting that green ribbon, and then everybody looks forward to cutting. The most important detail I'll share at a high level is it is a great use. I mean, with the town of Milton, for example, we were focusing solely on the town's usage at the time. We had some discussions with the school, which is a message I might share with the audience as well. Collaboration is going to be critical. I think that you've heard from what Dan and Madeleine shared and Joe shared, which is that there are limitations to this program. There aren't a ton of towns in New Hampshire that have a big load. But there are, maybe together, there might be a decent sized load that might exceed that, typical 1 megawatt threshold that we're all working under currently. And that's probably one of the, I would say, the challenges I put out to any of the towns that are listening in is how can you collaborate with some of your peers at the school or at the county or at any of these other political subdivisions, because that's going to be critical. You might get really excited about the fact you have this big open piece of either town-owned land or a landfill site that is a perfect, makes so much sense for solar to be developed. But if you find out after, not really paying as close attention maybe to your electric load that you only use, 200,000 kilowatt hours a year as a town, it may not be, as exciting to you because you're not really benefiting from this program. There are programs, as Dan has shared, there are great programs for on-site load that you can take advantage of. There are 1 megawatt programs you can take advantage of. But if you're really looking for scale and helping us all drive this message as a state, as an industry, as a country, as the world in general, to make positive impacts towards fighting climate change, you might be a little underwhelmed, maybe is the right term. But that all aside, I would say that when we were working with the town of Milton, we had some really great leadership at the Board of Selectmen level. They reached out to us. They asked if we had some interest in doing the project. We had some past experience. I had some past experience in Massachusetts doing a landfill project early in my career. Had enough knowledge to be, I'd say, maybe dangerous, but excited and innovative enough to try to go for it. And I set the expectation with the town that it was going to take time. Just like Joe, I think, experienced through his exercise with Peterborough, going through the different programs that were available early on when these projects were much more expensive, sometimes even twice what they are today to build. We were able to go through the process with the community. We were fortunate enough to get a PUC approval on a grant program. We were able to, build this project. It's been up and running for, I think, almost 5 years now. And this town, that spent about $30,000 a year in electricity expenses, was able to utilize their landfill by leasing the land, by creating a payment in lieu of tax or a pilot payment, and also getting a discount off their electric bill. So we were able to lower their electric bill from about $30,000 a year down to about $10,000 a year. So, big cities and communities may not really get excited about that kind of savings, but obviously some of these smaller towns, that makes a big difference. So that's one example that I wanted to share with the group today. And, we're very excited about, the possibility of what this program can eventually grow into. And I think that's what I'm hearing loud and clear from Madeleine and from Dan and Joe as well, is that, this is a starting point, and in true New Hampshire form, we always start somewhere and we end up somewhere else. With the right folks and people that are working hard and communities that can support all of our work, I see that this program can evolve into something that opens it up to some of these other areas. And Madeleine, you did a great job kind of, I think, educating everybody on some of the areas that are not eligible. I even learned a little bit today about that, so I appreciate your perspective, because you hear this concept of municipality and political subdivisions, that it's hard to really understand what that is. It might be good if we can put out maybe a link to what the state statute is on the political subdivision for everybody to see, so they can read it for themselves. But I think everybody did a great job today explaining where it is, what's included, what's excluded. And I think collectively as a community of folks in the renewable energy business, that we can bring ourselves together and support, again, the work that Revision's kind of taking the lead on at the policy level, and the organization here. I think we have a good chance of this program evolving. So I just want to thank everybody for allowing me to give a little example, support what Joe had to share about his experience with some of the brownfields, and pass it back for any information that Sam wants to kind of kick off, or any questions that might be for the rest of the group. But again, thanks so much for having me, and I look forward to more discussion.
Right. So thank you to all the panelists. That was really great. As Andrew said, you know, every time I hear from you folks, I also learn a little something more about this law that we've spent so much time thinking about and talking about. But you know, legislative language is complex, and that is exactly why we wanted to have this webinar for our members. So I really want to make sure that anyone who's in the audience has a chance to ask their questions. Those are the questions I think that really matter much more than anything I would put forth. So either use the chat or you can raise your hand. Josh Singer, who is on the webinar from Clean Energy New Hampshire and who is much more versed in how to run these from the GoToMeeting perspective, will make sure that those questions get answered. But in the meantime, I could maybe just sort of prime the pump, ask a couple questions that I know that I had, and still sort of remain. And I think this first one would probably be best to address both to Dan and Madeleine kind of jointly, because you know, Dan, you mentioned that you've crunched the numbers, you know how many municipalities are out there that can benefit. I guess the question that I have is really, how many kilowatt hours are there more or less up for grabs when it comes to load that could be net metered? And then Madeleine, my question is, how many kilowatt hours of hydro is there that could step in right now? You know, is already I forget the three terms you have: permitted, running, and ready. I think it's something along those lines. Versus how much really is there that the solar industry, or you know, other you know, perhaps more cutting edge stuff that is yet to be realized could take up.
Thanks, Sam. Great one. I don't have a spreadsheet in front of me right now, but to give folks just some rules of thumb, for a mid to larger size municipal wastewater treatment plant, that's usually the largest load center within the municipality, we see loads range from 1.5 million kilowatt hours up to 3 or 4 million, conceivably even larger for one of our largest cities like Manchester or Nashua. So you're talking, in a handful of cases, a wastewater treatment plant that could accommodate more than a megawatt. Typically for a city with public water sewer, that is the biggest load center by far. The rest, kind of in descending order, if it's a county, a nursing home, naturally with full HVAC requirements, commercial kitchens and all the rest, they could be north of 1 million kilowatt hours. Our larger high schools can be in the low millions of kilowatt hours, some as much as 2 or 3 million kilowatt hours. A typical high school with maybe 1,000 students is probably going to run a little under 1 million kilowatt hours. And then middle schools, elementary schools, highway departments, town halls, etc. So that's kind of rough numbers there. Again, we estimate that the number of communities that have north of the 8 million kilowatt hours, you can even push a little bit higher with a max size 5 megawatt, 4.99 megawatt solar array. The number of communities that could really max out this law, I could easily count on one hand. Those that could go somewhere between maybe 1 and 3 or 4 megawatts, maybe 2 hands would be my guess if we include the counties. Don't have the best numbers on our school districts. Love to hear from some of them. If you've crunched your numbers, we've certainly worked with a handful, but like I said, usually there's one high school, there's a few middle schools at maybe 500,000 kilowatt hours, 300 to 500,000 is pretty typical, and then a handful of lower schools in the 100 to 250,000 kilowatt hour range. So there is load there in the aggregate, but while you have this unfortunate mismatch of needing high load, but within the same geography where there isn't a lot of land, if you're talking one of our larger cities, it's tough to serve it. I do just want to add, and I'm so glad Andrew and Joe spoke to this, by no means should other towns, some of whom I'm sure are on today, give up on the possibility of embracing clean technologies to reduce taxpayer costs. Because while the economies of scale aren't as good for a megawatt or half a megawatt as they are for 3 or 5, the cost has come down very significantly nonetheless. This year's been tough with all the economic and supply chain challenges, but overall the cost curve is strongly in our favor. And we do see Revision's been privileged to work with dozens of communities, all of whom are saving money in similar ways to the great examples Joe and Andrew gave. So don't be discouraged, but if we're going to move the needle, address the climate crisis, we will need policy changes that go well beyond what was accomplished with HB315.
So I'll speak to our projects. We are looking to enroll members for 2 hydropower projects in Unitil territory. Together, those 2 projects generate 40 million kilowatt hours a year. So that's the amount of load in Unitil territory we're looking for. There was a press release that another hydropower owner operator, Central Rivers Power, that bought Eversource's, that bought the hydro plants that were previously owned by Eversource in the divestiture. They put out a press release that they are teaming up with Freedom Energy Logistics, and they also have 40 million kilowatt hours of generation that they're looking for load in, I think, in Eversource territory. And I know there are some other projects that are also become available and eligible in hydro, but I don't have an exact total number. So there's certainly more potential. And because we don't have the additional geographic limitation, even a teeny tiny town that has a teeny tiny load could join in a group. So there is not really, so really any eligible member, so if you are a municipal public entity of any sort, you could join in a hydro net metering group with either a lot of other small load entities or a couple of big ones, and then you just get added into the small load. So the potential for benefit really is for anyone. And then the potential for generation, I don't have an exact number, but it's, you know, certainly there's additional generators other than the ones that I just listed, which together are 80 million kilowatt hours. So certainly over 100 million kilowatt hours of hydro that has become eligible. We have a higher capacity factor, so we do generate more for the same total peak capacity.
This is sort of a needly question, but I'm curious. Can we talk about renewable energy credits and how towns should be thinking about those if they, you know, if they are generating them from a project that they're associated with? Should they be purchasing them and retiring them? Should they be selling them into the market to monetize them? So maybe one step back. For someone who's conversant in renewable energy credits, what are they, and how should towns be thinking about them in terms of how they interact with the renewable energy credit markets? Does anyone want to volunteer to take that question, or should I assign it?
I'm happy to take it, but
Before it.
I think any of us could answer it. So a renewable energy certificate is a commodity that's generated by renewable electricity generators. We generate electricity and we generate RECs. So RECs is what we call the environmental attribute. So it's the renewable nature of the electricity we generate. So if a customer wants to be able to claim that they are using renewable energy. So for example, sometimes at the grocery store, you might buy a product and it says made with 100% renewable energy. To be able to make that claim on a product, or to be, for example, a town that says we use 100% renewable energy, they not only would have to buy the electricity, but the renewable energy certificate as well. So if you own a renewable energy generator, you can, as Sam said, retire that REC. So if you hold on to it and don't sell it because it has a value, you can make that claim that you're using the renewable energy. Even if you have a solar array on your roof, but you sell your RECs to somebody else, you can't say that you're using the renewable energy that's generated by your own system, because the entity that's buying the REC is now able to make that claim. So that's something to take into consideration. It's a question we get. So when, for example, we're recruiting group net metering members, we're offering them a pretty good discount that they are not getting the RECs as part of that arrangement with us. They are getting a portion of the value of the net metering credit. We do sell our RECs to someone else, and that's part of our revenue for our project, and that's important to us. And we've talked to potential members and said, sure, if you wanted to buy the RECs, that could be discussed or negotiated. But in that case, you will be paying us rather than us paying you, because they would have to be paying for the value of the renewable energy certificate.
I'll just add that this is something we haven't touched on today, but worth, I think, just mentioning is for towns large or small, whether or not you can take advantage of HB315, we are seeing some positive policy changes at the federal level, which create better pathways to direct ownership of renewable generators, which automatically gives you rights to the RECs. And thanks to some healthy renewable portfolio standards in neighboring states like Massachusetts, we can sell those RECs today for a reasonably good value, higher than where they've been historically in the last few years, in the region of $40 per megawatt hour. We had a low under 10, even in the $3 a megawatt hour range 2-3 years ago, which was pretty painful, but they've rebounded nicely as other states and as part of our regional transmission grid have set more aggressive climate and clean energy goals. And specifically for a community looking to own their assets. As folks know, ARPA, the American Recovery Plan Act, out in the $2 trillion plan that was signed in the spring by President Biden, that allocated significant funds, roughly $105 per capita to New Hampshire towns, which were eligible for a variety of uses, including water and sewer infrastructure. And according to a US Treasury rule, that includes clean energy generators co-located with water and sewer treatment facilities. So we've had a couple of communities take advantage, put some of those ARPA funds toward clean energy projects. Another pot of money went to school districts, and we've had some schools take advantage as well. In some cases, replace a roof that needed to be done before solar. In other cases, even put some of that funding toward solar projects directly. In the recently passed federal infrastructure bill, $65 billion is earmarked for electric grid upgrades. Those monies won't be handed out, to our knowledge, to communities directly, but will hopefully help offset what are some rapidly increasing components of the cost stack, which is multiple reclosures and other grid upgrades to allow for interconnection of larger scale generators to the distribution grid. Probably most of those monies will go to the transmission side, which will help with utility scale, not so much with these sub 5 megawatt projects. But another pot of money, again, back to the ARPA opportunity, is in the infrastructure bill, $55 billion for water infrastructure. We haven't seen detailed rules from Treasury on that yet. It'll go through the rulemaking process, but our understanding is, or our somewhat optimistic assumption is, that they will follow the same precedent, which didn't just pertain to ARPA, but even to the American Recovery Act, ARA, of a decade ago, which also allowed for renewable energy generation projects to be co-located and funded with those same monies. So we don't know for certain if that's the case, but we are optimistic, particularly if the more ambitious Build Back Better Act passes. We can talk about some of the various exciting provisions in that, particularly on the tax side. But we do believe that more funding is coming, particularly for public sector, which can help to create a pathway for direct ownership of these projects, in which case, obviously, the RECs are yours as well.
One thing I wanted to add that I forgot to mention earlier is that as group net metering group members, you can stay on a competitive supply contract, which is pretty important to mention for this type of, for larger customers. Typically, you've already gone out and looked for competitive supply, which allows you to pay less for your electricity. As a group member, you can stay on that contract. And when we're talking about procuring RECs, you can generally procure RECs or a mix of renewable energy directly in your competitive energy supply contract. And that in several instances may be more cost effective than buying the RECs from the project you're group net metering with. So we can get really wonky into REC arbitrage, but you can buy cheaper RECs to be able to make that claim of renewable energy and then sell the RECs from your project to increase the payback of your project.
which leads us down to a very wonky rabbit hole about rec additionality and voluntary rec markets, and we'll spend, you know, the rest of the webinar talking about that. I do see we have a question from the audience, but I am not 100% sure how to activate it. If Josh, if you're paying attention, so it's Rayo, probably saying your name wrong, Rayo Bumgara. And if I can figure out how to unmute you, I will. Also, Rayo, if okay, Rayo, you have an open line, I believe. No? All right, well, I'll leave your mic unmuted. And if you want to ask your question, feel free to. In the meantime, I'm curious if maybe in the waning minutes here, if we could talk about, so this might be a Joe or an Andrew question. With regards to solar, how big of a deal is the step up from 1 megawatt to 5 megawatts in terms of the economies of scale, and how much more attractive of a project municipalities who do have that load and who can get those bigger projects, how big of a deal is that?
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. We try to focus on that when we're having these policy discussions, because we're not asking for, you know, a higher incentive or more incentive dollars, just the ability to do a larger project, which solves a lot of issues. And there are pretty big economies of scale. And we were talking recently about, we really start to notice a difference after 2 megawatts. So 1 to 2 is roughly not a huge increase in economies of scale, but as you go above 2, that's where you really start to see a huge difference. I will just say that you know, the supply rate in New Hampshire, if it's around 9 cents, and if you are doing one of these projects as a power purchase agreement, selling the power at a discount, say that's 8 cents of revenue coming in, that is a lot lower than the solar programs in the community solar programs in Maine, Massachusetts, and other markets that are starting to create new community solar programs. So, you know, and I think that's how it goes in New Hampshire. The economics are lean, but I do think, you know, they will work, you know, above 2 or 3 megawatts. But it is even hard to make those 1 to 2 megawatt projects, you know, pencil out in New Hampshire.
Okay, so Joe, go ahead, Andrew. Sorry.
Just quick, I was just going to agree 100% with what Joe said. We've done the same analysis, and right around 2 to 2.5 megawatts is really where you start to see those economies of scale. The only add-on I would put into that is when you're looking at some of these brownfield or Superfund sites that some communities may have, you get that economy of scale at that level, but you're going to have a little bit of a reduction in that economies of scale when you go onto a landfill. They typically are about 15 or 20% more costly to build than doing a typical greenfield site, and obviously exponentially much more expensive than like a rooftop potentially. So I just wanted to just shed some light there that we do see those costs, and everything does have to be above grade. You're obviously working on a very sensitive environment, so there's a lot more requirement at the permitting level and the development level, even before you get to construction. So it's a little bit more involved, but still a great use of land. Just again, wanting to make sure that the expectations are set with these communities that are looking at these pieces of land they have. Greenfield would probably, type of land would be much more conducive as far as costs. But again, we love the landfills. It's a great use of land like we talked about. So just want to add that little tidbit in there.
Almost as if we wanted to prioritize those types of projects, there should be some sort of program to make them easier. I'll just throw that out there. So I'm going to go to Don Willett, who I'm seeing has a question. If you all need to go, also it's 1 o'clock, but I just want to make sure that we do have a chance for some of the attendees to ask their questions. So Don, I believe you're unmuted. If you want to ask your question.
Yeah, hi. I want to thank everyone for being here. It's a real learning session as we're trying to expand community solar in New Hampshire. And my one question is, oh, actually, I have two. One was already answered in the presentation you provided. But Madeleine, I have a question about the hydro. I may have misheard it, but it sounded like when you were talking about who was eligible to be an off-taker in the hydro portion of this program, is it still limited to the political entities, or does it include commercial and nonprofit potential off-takers?
No, it's still limited to the same public entities, so it still has to be municipal, school, or county. The difference is that there's not an additional geographic limitation as to who can be in your group. So for example, our hydropower projects are in Unitil territory. They are located partially in Concord and partially in Boscawen, which just then I would be a little unsure about which town we're in, but because we're in Unitil territory, our members can be anywhere in Unitil territory, both the capital region and the Seacoast region. As opposed to if you were to build a new solar project in Concord, or if we were to develop a new hydro project in Concord, it's not technology specific, then our members could only be in Concord, for example.
Okay.
So they still have to be public entities, but because we're existing generators, the members can be anywhere in the utility service territory.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say that I think everyone in this webinar right now is hoping for the expansion similar to what we see in New York, Massachusetts, and Maine. And I want to thank all of you for trying to get to that point, because I think that is the end goal all of us are looking for. So let's continue to work for it. We're doing small steps. Hopefully those small steps will lead to big strides. Thank you.
Sorry about that, Don. Overeager. I just one more question from Tom Garden. I want to make sure that we get it in and get everyone off to their day on time here. Maybe. How many times do I have to click it before they're unmuted? Okay, Tom, you're live. Go for it.
Well, thank you. I'll be brief. I wrote out my question. I don't know if you folks can read that. Can you read the question I submitted?
Is it in the chat? Oh yeah,
Yeah.
there. No, I don't see it. Questions. I have to
Well, I
confess.
sent it, but here it is. All I asked was, could someone just give a very brief idea of what the economics are for a typical House Bill 315 solar project? Particularly, let's say if it's in Eversource territory, what is the someone mentions that the credit is valued at the supply rate. I'm wondering what that supply rate is typically for a municipal off-taker.
So the supply rate's going to vary every 6 months. The utilities are going to issue a new supply rate, and there's typically a winter rate which tends to be higher and a summer rate which tends to be lower. But for those who know those numbers really well, what are we in the ballpark of? No one wants to be a Johnny on the spot. Dan, why don't you go ahead? I can't hear you. What happened here? Oh, Madeleine's unmuted.
There you go. I was gonna say we were unable to unmute ourselves. You had taken control, Sam.
Yeah, I think we're in the almost 9-cent range right now based on Eversource. The new rates that are coming out. Dan, can you confirm that? You know that offhand? Yeah.
So as a group net metering member, generally you enter into an agreement with a host where they are going to offer you a certain amount of that, of of that value of that net metering credit. So if you're building a new project, right, you have to pay either for the cost of the project and then you get the whole value, or you can have a power purchase agreement based on that new project. Or for an existing project like us, we enter into agreement with members to share a certain amount of the value of the net metering credit back to our members. And so the detail of those arrangements, you know, obviously you would have to talk to different vendors, developers, project owners to be able to find out what the best deal for your community can be.
All right, all. We're 6 minutes over. I don't want to hold you too long. Thank you all so much for taking the time. I hope this was really valuable to all the members. And please, if you are a Clean Energy New Hampshire member and you liked this webinar or you like anything else that we do, don't hesitate to reach out to us with ideas for other webinars that might be useful to you as a member. We're always looking for new stuff to put up. And also just generally thank you all for your support of Clean Energy New Hampshire, because as we mentioned, this organization has historically been and aims to continue to be a key member of pushing for better policies to make more of these types of projects feasible, regardless of the political climate. And in fact, trying to change the dialogue so that political climate stops to be a major issue is one of our huge goals. So thank you so much for taking the time, and be well, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.